So we are now recording, and I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you, put it in presentation mode. All right, now if you cannot see it, let me know, but you should see my PowerPoint there, and we're recording, so this is great. Okay, so here we go. Just really quickly about me. If you don't know me, since we all did intros, I grew up in Southern California and did my undergraduate in anthropology at Brigham Young University, and then got my way into sort of a joint degree between forestry and theology at Yale, which out of anthropology, I was very interested in understanding the human landscape around trees and forests. And so after undergrad, I wanted to delve a little deeper into the management side and the ecological side of forestry. But they also had a sort of a joint degree program. So I ended up between forestry and theology at Yale. And that really informed my PhD work out here in British Columbia at the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability, where I studied the land management and spirituality of Roman Catholic monks, some of whom have forestry operations. So it's all kind of tied together. But since I got my PhD in 2017, I've taught it at the University of British Columbia, Western Washington University, Corpus Christi College, which is a Catholic liberal arts college here in Vancouver. And I'm currently a kind of a joint appointed lecturer between the Department of Humanities and the Faculty of Environment at Simon Fraser University. So this workshop is the seed for a course that I might teach at Simon Fraser that would be a little longer and a little more academic. And if you're interested in following along, you can, with my writing and my work, you can follow me or sign up for my email at holyscapes.org. And that's enough about me. So let me just give a quick overview of the workshop, right? So I come at this as a very, very broad generalist. I wouldn't say I'm even an expert in any one discipline. So I'm very interdisciplinary, religious studies, ethics, philosophy, and ecology. And we're also coming at this, I'm also coming at this from an interreligious perspective. So raised in the Mormon tradition, but practicing in the Anglo-Catholic tradition these days, but very much connected to trees and forests in my spiritual life. And so in the current climate with the COVID pandemic, a workshop like this may seem a little peripheral, but there's a lot of articles coming out talking about just how important outside spaces are to our self-care during a time like this. So I think it's a very timely topic, even as we kind of wait and see what happens with the pandemic. And another reason that I call this a workshop and not a course or a lecture series is because I'm hoping to sort of facilitate a process of exploration. I'm not going to tell anyone how to experience trees and forests. I'm not going to make any kind of metaphysical claims about trees and forests. So it's really a process of facilitation where we get to, especially at the beginnings of our time together, discuss what we have been doing in the week previous, right, with the assignments. But I do definitely have some content that I'll be sharing over the next 5 weeks. Especially the first 4 weeks will be more content. The last week will be more reflection. But today what I'll do is give a sort of a broad overview of what I'm calling the global forest. So that's the title of the first lecture, the global forest. So I'll talk about very briefly, the evolution of trees, the evolution of the human relationship with trees, and then sort of set the stage for what we're looking at in terms of the global situation of trees and forests. Next week, we'll get really into the heart of the human, the spiritual side of human relationships to trees and forests, and I'll go through mythology, literature, and uh, religious studies and the religion's relationship to trees and forests. In the third week, where the paradigm that I'll be sort of thinking with is called the new forest. So what we'll do that week is really talk about how Western civilization has shifted in its understanding of trees and forests from merely a commodity, merely a zone for extracting natural resources, to one of interconnection, ecological complexity, and even intersubjectivity. So this sort of the relationship between beings rather than human persons and natural objects. And then in the fourth week, we'll really dig even deeper into that and talk about the what we call the phenomenology of trees, or just the way that we experience trees in our day-to-day life. So moving from that that conversation about trees as beings, subjects, and into a more specifics of how we experience trees in our lives. And that'll be I'll kind of go through a series of examples of interesting projects and collaborations that people are up to these days. And then last week, we'll talk about the future forest, all the things that are exciting about trees and forests, reforestation, the relationship between climate change and trees and forests. So that's the roadmap from here on out. And it's going to be it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it. So logistically, hopefully you have a copy of the syllabus, and these are the recommended materials, right? Obviously you're here, so access to internet, webcam, microphone for our workshop and discussion. Access to a good field notebook or sketchbook, so you can spend some time reflecting in the field or drawing. A relevant field guide to trees. And in our Q&A, I'll show you a couple of mine. There are readings on the syllabus, but I would say that they're optional. We're not putting a strong emphasis on critical reading in the workshop, more on the work that you're doing in between the sessions. And if you're interested in the material, I'm happy to email you copies of the PowerPoints as PDFs, and the videos of the lectures and discussions will be available for private use afterwards. All right. Here's just a couple of readings that I would recommend you get your hands on at some point if this is something you're interested in terms of lifelong learning, but these are also on the syllabus. The most recent Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, State of the World's Forest. It's a great summary of what's happening with deforestation. Matthew Hall's book, Plants as Persons, A Philosophical Botany, where he kind of goes through the world religions and talks about how each of the traditions frames plants either as objects or as actors in their scriptures or in their traditions. Lila June on the Forest as Farm is an online resource, which is a great interview with an indigenous woman who talks about the perception among historians or even just everyday folks like us that pre-Columbian indigenous people just sort of harvested the bounty or hunted the bounty of the land rather than aggressively managing the land through fire and cultivation. So she talks a lot about the forest as a farm, the way that indigenous people expertly manage their food systems before agricultural or agrarian societies from Europe colonized North America. Another great one is Alexander Porto's The Forest in Folklore and Myth, where he goes through the kind of canon of Western folklore, talks about the relationship between trees and forests. Richard Powers' The Overstory is a great a novel that came out recently that traces the sort of family lineage of 7 or 8 main characters and their relationship to trees over several generations. And of course, Peter Wohlleben's The Hidden Life of Trees, which is very popular. But he kind of goes through in very simple language and talks about how science is kind of rethinking the way that we talk about plant biology, communication, and feeling, and the ways in which plants and trees are really actively sensing their environments and not just, background or backdrop. All right, so that's readings. By today, you hopefully had a look at the syllabus at the assignment 0, which is basically something that you could do throughout the workshop. So if you haven't done this yet, you're not behind. But basically the idea is to get a hold of a local field guide and pick 20 trees or so, 15 to 20, and start to get to know them a little better. Their names and their biology and ecology, and just spend a few minutes each day with one of these trees, reflecting on their history or the aesthetics of the trees, or memories that you might have of them, and just jot down some ideas. So you'll both be getting to know your local trees, but also kind of reflecting on their presence in your life. And if you'd like to keep the journal assignments private, you don't have to email them to me, but I'd love to have a look at them before we get together next Wednesday. So you can email them to me by the previous Monday, just so I have time to have a look. And I'll go over the assignment for next week at the end of the discussion. All right, so unless there's any logistical questions, I'm gonna jump into the content for today, or for this week. All right, so week 1, the global forest. Our learning objectives today. I will give a very brief overview of the evolution of trees and forests, and sort of what we mean by trees and forests by definition, and then define them in relation to human societies. And then I'll go through a series of slides on the main issues facing trees and forests globally, into which we are kind of putting into which we are exploring our personal connection and relationship to trees and forests in many different parts of the world. All right, so I wanted to start with this image, which I took this year, actually. I was commuting twice a week to Bellingham to teach some courses down there, and these 2 trees always greeted me on my way to class, and they were just so beautiful. One is an American beech, and the other is a giant sequoia. And there's just, I wanted to start with the image of these 2 trees because trees from the very beginning have this very kind of profound impact on us. They are literally embodied history, right? The growth rings have been around for many dozens of years. They embody a kind of history. They draw our eyes upward to the sky. We might have memories of climbing trees as kids. So there's something very kind of primal and beautiful about trees. And it's while I was working in Bellingham, these were 2 of my favorites. All right, so definitionally, what is a tree? It's pretty straightforward, even though it's one of those things where you kind of know it when you see it, right? So a tree is basically a woody perennial plant that has a single, usually elongated stem, right? With very few branching patterns in its lower part. So it usually has a long bole or stem, right? And so what do I mean by perennial? Perennial is any kind of plant that persists year after year, right? So new growth comes from the perinating part, or the part that continually grows, right? So trees are woody perennials. They come back year after year, and they grow very tall. And by woody, of course, I just mean the hard fibrous substance that evolved to get the plants up above their competition, right? Mostly made of cellulose and lignin, that makes up the tree's stems and branches, right? So pretty straightforward definition. In terms of evolution, we have on this slide we have a kind of basic schema of the major eons, eras, and periods in geologic history. And trees, so the plants that began to develop wood in order to compete with their other plants around them, began to evolve around 400 million years ago, right? So that's in the Devonian period, which is the Paleozoic era, right? So just about 400 million years ago, plants began, mostly ferns, began to develop these sort of harder, woody stems so that they could grow up above their competition. So this landscape, this Devonian period, had plants, but it was mostly just about waist high, right? So wood develops to solve a problem, right? There's competition, and these plants were able to grow taller than other plants, and so they were able to survive. So what we call arborescence, right? This tendency to grow tall was achieved through this, the development of vascular tissue in wood, right? So vascular plants developed to transport water and nutrients from the ground and sugar from the leaves, right? But wood is a special kind of innovation that basically turns those cells into hard, hard substance that can grow outward and upward. So primary growth goes up and secondary growth goes out. And that wood is mostly made up of old xylem cells. So xylem are the vascular tissue that draws water and nutrients from the soil and brings it up into the plant, into the tree. And phloem are the vascular tissues that take the sugars from the leaves produced by photosynthesis and distribute them throughout the plant and the tree, right? And so on those secondary growth on what's called the lateral meristem, the bark, right? Every year the tree is putting on more xylem cells as it moves outward, and the phloem cells are the sort of bark that's pushing its way outward, right? And so that is the sort of genius of trees, that they were trying to get up and above other plants. And it looks like the very first plant to develop this woody tissue was the watieza, which was a kind of fern, right? And it grew to about 26 feet or 8 meters right around this period during the Devonian. All right, so this is a great website. I used this when I was teaching a natural disasters class, but you can basically go back through most of Earth's history and see what the Earth was like, 100, 200, 300 million years ago. And this is about what the US looked like, and Canada didn't quite exist yet when plants began to evolve, right? So just about 400 million years ago. So it's a fun website to explore. All right. Now this is right an entire domain of knowledge, taxonomy, but I'm just going to spend one slide on some very basics because, Some of us are more oriented analytically to understanding names and taxonomies. So if you're drawn to that, you know, I would encourage you to work with that in your in between workshops. But if you're more of an intuitive and aesthetic person, then you don't necessarily have to focus so much on taxonomy. But just some basic categories and vocabulary I thought might be helpful. It's kind of mind-blowing, but there's 60,000, approximately 60,000 different species of trees on Earth. But there's only two basic, maybe three or four, but two very dominant basic divisions of trees. The hardwood broadleaf trees, which make up around 200 families, and the conifers, which are about approximately seven. Of course, the conifers were dominant early in tree evolution, but about 100 million years ago, broadleaf hardwood trees diversified and became more dominant globally, especially in tropical regions. Among the hardwood broadleafs, we have kind of two basic categories: the monocots and the dicots. Right, that's one leaf and two leaf when they germinate. And these are also called angiosperms, right? The seeds that any tree or any plant that has that produces seeds within an ovary, right, or some sort of fruit and flower, broadleaves. Now, and then the other is the conifers, which are the gymnosperms, so the naked sperm seeds. They have the seed not within an ovary, it's sort of on a bract outside. And you see those in the cones, right? Like the pine cones or gymnosperms, right? And so this is the kind of basic division, conifers and hardwoods, because when you talk about deciduous trees or trees that lose their leaves, right? There are conifer trees that are deciduous, right? So it's not a very good way to distinguish. For example, the larch tree or the dawn redwood, those are conifer trees that lose their leaves, right? Another kind of fascinating contemporary tree that's not in any of these categories, it's in its own genera altogether, is the ginkgo biloba. And that's a tree that evolved around 270 million years ago, but is basically a living fossil. This picture on the slide is a ginkgo tree. And it has no kind of contemporary relatives. And it's thought that it was kept alive by Chinese monastics, Taoist and Buddhist monastics in their monasteries. And that's most likely why it has survived until the present day. And now it's a very popular street tree. You see it all over the place. But it's kind of an amazing tree. All right. Now, into definitions of forests, right? We talked about trees, woody plants that grow real tall. So what's a forest? It's a bunch of woody plants that grow real tall all together, right? So a forest is a dense growth of trees. And again, you kind of know it when you see it, right? How many trees does it take to make a forest? How dense do they have to be before they become a savanna, right? There's a lot of different opinions about this, but basically an area that is dominated by trees and accompanied by all the biodiversity that comes with that, right? Etymologically, forest actually didn't even necessarily suggest a wooded area. It was just outside, right? The foray was just an area that was most often designated for hunting by a royalty, right? So it was an area set aside for royal hunting. It could have been wooded or not, right? But the origin of that word is a little obscure, but in the Latin, it was silva, sylvan, right? Silviculture is the word for trees and forests. And we have all of these other cognates like wold, like Walden Pond, right? Wold is the root is for forest, Weald and Holt, Firth and Firth. My family has some holts in it, so that's a woody tree related name. And so we talked about in the previous slide, probably the first trees were some kind of fern, but most likely the first major extensive forests were the Archaeopteris, which was a kind of hybrid fern conifer that grew about 30 meters tall during the Devonian, which evolved between 420 and 360 million years ago, and the Lepidodendralis trees, which were about 50 meters tall and came along a little later, between 358 and 298 million years ago. So these are the earliest forests that we know of from the fossil record. Now, shifting gears to people, from an evolutionary perspective, the extinction of the dinosaurs made way for the sort of flourishing of mammals. And this little guy on the screen, the Plesiotopus, is thought to be one of the early mammalian ancestors of primates from whom humans evolved. So just about 55 to 58 million years ago, this mammal, which was a tree dweller, gave rise to the diversity of primate species, of which, you know, we have common ancestors. Now, the ancestors of humans kind of diverged from chimpanzees around 6 million years ago. We kind of come down from the trees, as the myth or the story goes, right? We stand upright. We adapt to being able to walk long distances, having our eyes in front, being able to see at a distance, right? And our use of tools really distinguish us from other primates. And our brains just grow very quickly from a geologic time scale. And so this is the kind of standard narrative that we get in textbooks, right? Human beings evolved, we came out of the trees and then adapted to the savanna. And so there might have been some antipathy between humans and trees, right? So if you take it, one perspective would be that it's better for us to be able to see what's coming. So we don't want trees around. So we harness fire to burn trees and keep the savannas open so we can see game and see threats coming, right? So this is an interesting question depending on your perspective, right? Did human beings leave trees and then develop a kind of animosity, or were we always in this sort of tight-knit relationship? And I think you can read the past either way. For example, there's evidence that some hominid species were forest dwellers, right? They didn't necessarily leave the forest. They stayed put. So the Ardipithecus ramidus and the Australopithecus afarensis, there's evidence that they were forest dwellers about 3 million years ago. But then on the other side, there's also evidence that when Homo sapiens reached Europe, that there was widespread use of fire to displace trees in order to make room for game animals and to be able to see any kind of coming threats. So it's an interesting question. We can maybe discuss it afterwards, but depending on how you see human evolution, there could be a kind of antagonism, antipathy, fear of trees and forests, or there could be a deep resonance, harmony. But I think it's both and, right? Because as we'll see next week, a lot of our fairy tales and myths and stories have both, that forests can be both enchanted places and they can be places of danger and uncertainty. So we'll see about that next week. All right, trees in human culture. There's obviously infinite number of uses and values that humans extract from trees. Food-wise, a lot of the food that we consume comes from trees. All of our caffeinated beverages, a lot of our chocolate our spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, our oils, olive oil, sugars like maple syrup and fruits and nuts come from trees. Fuel wood, firewood, which is obviously was essential in early human societies, but continues to be very important to indigenous people and agrarian peoples all over the world. As a building material, wood and timber is a major part of the economy, especially where I live in British Columbia. Trees and forests are a big part of the economy, and there's always fights going on about how much to cut and how much old growth to preserve and the like. Wood is made for consumer goods. You know, I've got this huge list here, but our entire seafaring culture owes itself to trees. Furniture. I'm sitting at a desk with some with pine. It looks like pine wood as the material, and kind of an IKEA desk. Tools, tool handles, coffins, spoons, paper. Right. If you the notebooks that you use, unless you get some sort of 100% recycled or some kind of other alternative fiber, most likely coming from trees, right? Trees also in the tropics especially provide materials for latex, for making rubber and tires, for dye. Religious and artistic carvings come from trees. Medicinal plants, whether they have a habitat in forests or whether they come from the leaves of trees or the fruits. Fodder for animals, hunting, recreation, watersheds, a big component of probably most of our municipal water supplies owes their management to trees and forests in some way. And then, of course, the mythical sacred domain of trees in human culture is what we'll dig into next week. All right, in terms of ecosystem services, which by that I just mean, what is it that trees and forests do for us for free, right? What's the work that they perform for us for free just by existing, right, for the ecosystem? So forests account for up to 75% of the primary productivity of the Earth's biosphere. Primary productivity is when plants convert sunlight into energy, and then that energy is consumed by insects and by mammals, and then goes right up the trophic levels to predators, and then back to the soil, to bacteria and fungi. So forests account for up to 75% of that productivity, a major share. And they contain a huge portion of the Earth's plant biomass, right? Massive, 80% of the Earth's plant biomass is contained in the volume, in the mass of trees. And that's terrestrial, obviously. In addition, forests produce oxygen, which we all breathe in local, especially local communities, right? And they produce the water vapor that transpires into the rain that falls and waters crops or that we drink. As I mentioned in the last slide, trees and forests are a really important factor when it comes to drinking water. Municipal water systems are often forested lands, right? So they allow for the slow release of water into streams and creeks rather than this sort of big rushing release with really turbid water. They're a major sink of pollutants and carbon dioxide. Wood is made of carbon dioxide. Trees breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, the opposite of what we do. And lots of plants, lots of trees in the urban areas, like ginkgo biloba, which you mentioned, are very good at kind of absorbing pollutants out of the air. Another ecosystem service that trees provide is disaster risk reduction. So that means things like uh, the forests along coastlines, where things like tsunamis come along, right? If you have these mangrove trees, they can mitigate the impact of tsunamis. They can also prevent major landslides and um, mudslides if you keep hillsides forested. Um, even though that it can still happen if you get too much rain, the trees will just go right down with it. But they often provide a good buffer against erosion and landslides. And lastly, forests are very important habitat, right? So tons of the Earth's biodiversity finds its home in forests. Up to 80% of amphibian species, 75% of bird species, 68% of mammal species, and 60% of vascular plant species are found in forested areas. So very essential part of the planet's biodiversity, especially tropical regions where biodiversity is so high. All right, so the FAO, the State of the World's Forests that just came out this year, estimates that there are approximately 3 trillion trees on Earth, which is pretty amazing that they can estimate the approximate number of trees. And as I mentioned, about 60,000 species of trees. Forests currently cover about 30% of the total land area, though before industrialization it was much higher. 50% of that forest cover is found in 5 countries. So a big share of the world's forests found in Russia, the US, Canada, Brazil, and China. Those are the sort of global heavy hitters for forest cover. 1/3 of the world's forest is primary. And by that, we just mean forest that hasn't been heavily altered by human disturbance. It's not part of a kind of, like a forestry cutting cycle. Sometimes we would say old growth forest, but it isn't necessarily old growth, but primary. So it hasn't been disturbed by people. And forests are a major part of, continue to be a major part of people's livelihood. So 1.6 million people still rely heavily on forest ecosystems for their consumption of their food, medicine, fodder, or for economic enterprises. All right, I wanted to throw this in because it's kind of a fun slide, but just to give a sense of the superlatives, right? What are the tallest, biggest, and oldest trees in the world? So as far as I know, the tallest tree is this coast redwood tree named Hyperion, which is about 116 meters tall, or 380 feet tall. So it's a very tall tree. So the coast redwood tree is one of those trees that just continues to grow. It just gets very, very tall. But its relative, the sequoia, the giant sequoia, is the bulkiest tree. Maybe it doesn't get as tall, but it grows very wide. So a giant sequoia in Tulare County, California, named General Sherman, is the biggest tree at 1,487 meters cubed, or 52,500 cubic feet. So that's a lot of tree. And I think I visited General Sherman with my brother in 2004, I think it was. We went camping out there. And there was a big sign there, and it talked about, like, if General Sherman was a gas tank, you could fill it with enough gas to drive your car around the world 600 times or something. It was some very silly analogy of like driving your car around the world 1,000,000 times. So that was memorable. And the oldest tree or the oldest trees, right? There's always a kind of shifting baseline. Is it this tree or that tree? But the sort of on average, the oldest trees are these bristlecone pine trees that live on the ridges in California and Nevada. And they can be up to 5,000 years old, some of these trees. So they're just beautiful. And my mom and I went and visited one of these groves on our way back from a camping trip a few years ago. And they're just, they're very beautiful trees. All right, another great example of kind of superlative and interesting trees are quaking aspen, because they look like pretty small trees, pretty young. They grow to about 150 years old max, but they're clonal, so they grow underground, and they reach these, with fire, stand replacing fire, the stems may die, but they underground, they keep growing. And so scientists estimate that the bigger the patch, the older the clone. So this clone of quaking aspen that they call Pando is located in Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. And it covers about 106 acres. So, which is about, and it has about almost 50,000 trees or stems. And they estimate that it could be as old as 80,000 years old, based on the sort of the genetics of the tree and the size of the patch, this 106 acre patch. Yeah, when I was living in Utah, we went and visited it, and it's a beautiful area. But that area was really hit heavily by the spruce beetle, the pine beetle, and the deer and the elk really love to nibble on the aspen sprouts. So Pando's having a tough time regenerating. So they're trying to figure out ways to regenerate the aspen, because it's the trees are growing tall and old and then dying, but they're not replacing themselves. So they're trying to figure out how to manage that better. All right. I kind of debated about whether to include this, but I think it's an interesting topic for discussion in terms of public perception of trees and forests, because during the big fires we had in Brazil, which were terrible, we had this conversation about them being the lungs of the earth. And it's actually kind of a myth that the Amazon are the lungs of the whole earth. Certainly they provide the oxygen that the Amazon breathes, but in some ways it's kind of a closed system, right? The amount of oxygen in our atmosphere, which is at about 20%, was mostly produced during what's called the Great Oxygenation, right? So about 2.4 billion years ago, as these cyanobacteria began to photosynthesize, oxygen began accumulating in the atmosphere. Most of that, the biomass of those organisms is now the fossil fuels underground, right? But that massive percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere is kind of a mystery to scientists, because it's an element that really likes to form bonds. It doesn't really necessarily like to sit around. So the oxygen that's produced from local forests is usually consumed by local oxygen-breathing organisms, right? So a lot of our oxygen comes from this fossil source, or even from organisms in the ocean, right? A lot of the phytoplanktons and cyanobacteria that are releasing oxygen. The Amazon actually only accounts for about 6% of the oxygen made by photosynthetic organisms, and a lot of that is just consumed locally. So I bring that up not to necessarily debunk our notion that trees are essential to our lives, but that it's sometimes easy to kind of tell stories about our relationship to trees and forests, which of course I think is awesome and part of our part of what it means to be human. But it's also good to kind of hold those up to scientific scrutiny sometimes. All right, so threats to our global forest. I just have a few more slides before we can wrap up and converse, but I want to go through some of the threats. So a few different terms: deforestation, which on surface level, it just means clearing a wide area of trees. So that could be a logging operation, or it could be converting something into a plantation, like a palm oil plantation, right? So it's not a very precise term. And as we'll see, there's some controversy about just how much deforestation is happening. But what we really definitely need to worry about is land conversion, when urbanization or agricultural developments turn forests into something else that can't grow back, right? Land conversion is the big red flag in my book. But yes, we also need to be talking about how we're managing our forest lands as well. Fragmentation, of course, is when we build roads or urbanizations through forests. And so these large sections of trees and forests get cut up into blocks. And that can be very bad, especially for large predators who need bigger blocks of habitat. And lastly, degradation, which is basically just the decline of trees and forests. Or illegal logging, where you go in and high grade or cut out the big trees, so you're impoverishing the stock of trees, or you burn an area of trees, or there's too many people walking off the pathways. Even that can be degradation, right? Leading to erosion, or to the compacting of soil, or the reduction of biodiversity, or even killing the next generation of trees, right? If we're not being careful with the understory. All right, so here are some of the big numbers, some of the harrowing numbers about trees and forests. Definitely will end the course on an optimistic note, but there is definitely some bad news as well, right? So since 1990, the area of primary forest, primary has decreased by 80 million hectares. So if you want that in acres, you just, I think, multiply by 2.5, but 80 million hectares of primary forest. So that's a big number, but it's not necessarily converted land, right? It's primary forest that was cut and then maybe has grown back, some of that. But land conversion has been even worse, right? We're talking about 420 million hectares of land since 1990 that has been lost, right? That has been converted to some other use, primarily agricultural, right? Yes, urbanization is a threat to forests, but primarily it's tropical countries who are developing their economies and converting primary forest or secondary forest into pasture or agricultural plantations, right? However, in the last several decades, that rate of deforestation has declined from 16 million hectares per year to 10 million. So still very high, but globally there's been a coordinated effort to try to reduce the area that's being cut. Now, some of the hot spots in Brazil, the current president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, has increased Amazon deforestation in the Amazon. But deforestation in the Amazon is a highly politicized topic that goes back and forth between, Brazilian leaders who want greater sovereignty. They don't want the UN and environmental groups telling them what to do with their trees and forests, and the influence of global conservation organizations that see the Amazon as a global resource of biodiversity. So that's a very dicey political football. Another interesting problem with talking about the metrics of deforestation is that we have two very different estimates. So the Global Forest Watch is one estimate, and their method is basically compiling data from satellite images, right? So they go through satellite images and look at the current year, and they say, is this block forested or unforested, right? So they're looking at current tree cover estimates and then comparing those over previous years. So for example, in 2017, their estimate was 72 million acres of deforestation, right? That's a much bigger number than the next estimate from the Global Forest Resources Assessment, which is what the FAO uses. And they basically go through and estimate, is this tract of land forest land or not, right? So it may not have trees on it at the moment, but is it forest land, right? So was it clear cut and it's going to grow back, right? So their estimate is forest land designation, right? And so for them in 2017, they're at 8.2 million acres. So that's a big discrepancy between the GFW and the FRA. And you can see why those two numbers are so different. But a lot of this deforestation and land conversion is happening in Latin America and Southeast Asia, where economies are developing and converting land into commodity agriculture. And in the literature, there's a big debate about whether secondary forests are as biodiverse as primary forests, whether primary forests or secondary forests grow back as quickly as people estimated. In the 90s, we talked a lot about deforestation in the Amazon being forever, right? It's like, once we cut these trees down, they'll never come back. But a lot of that data was just not true. Tropical forests are surprisingly resilient and grow back very quickly. And no, they do not reach the same level of biodiversity, but that can be amended through enrichment planting. So there's questions about just how fragile primary forests really are. And again, that plays into the stories that we'd like to tell about trees and forests being these sort of pristine areas where we shouldn't meddle, or these very resilient adaptive spaces that we can modify. It's a really interesting conversation to have. All right, here's an image of this sort of the former estimates, right? So each of the colors represents deforestation or forest clearance by various factors. So the green, of course, is forestry. So they're looking at land that's been cleared by forest operations, but that is still designated as forest. The red is commodity-driven deforestation, so usually conversion to agriculture. The yellow is shifting agriculture, so areas where indigenous people are cutting or burning, planting, and then abandoning it where it grows back as secondary and tertiary forest. Wildfire has been a big one. We can see wildfire in South America and in Russia and in North America has been a big factor in forest clearance, but those forests grow back as well. And in a lot of cases, fire is integral to the ecosystem. Urbanization is part of that, but it's hard to see on this map any areas that are very obviously affected by urbanization. And then the gray is zero or minor loss. So we have big sections of the Amazon, Sub-Saharan Africa, Papua New Guinea, Russia, and Canada, which are kind of minimal change. All right. We have to talk about climate change, of course. The IPCC estimates that deforestation accounts for about 15% of global greenhouse emissions. So one of at least the top three sources of emissions for climate change. But they also point very quickly to the fact that they're a major part of the solution, at least up to 30%. Their most recent publication on keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius says this, quote, "Forests are a major requisite front of action in the global fight against catastrophic climate change, thanks to their unparalleled capacity to absorb and store carbon. Stopping deforestation and restoring damaged forests could provide up to 30% of the climate solution." So not only are they integral to human economy, to human spirituality, but they're also a big part of this conversation moving forward about climate change. In terms of carbon sequestration, a lot of people are talking about bioenergy, using trees to generate electricity, which would replace fossil fuels, carbon-based fossil fuels. However, I'm pretty skeptical about this whole move to turn trees into energy, because the payoff is over many, many years, and sometimes it's not quite clear if the accounting fully accounts for the time period it's going to take for those trees to replace themselves. So there's a lot of pushback and controversy about whether or not bioenergy is actually carbon negative. So that's kind of an ongoing conversation, but there's a lot of bioenergy boosters out there that say, turning trees into energy is the way to go. I'm not so sure. There's also controversy about whether or not we should be cutting old growth and planting young trees because they absorb carbon quicker. There's been studies that say that old growth forests actually are still absorbing carbon, and that they actually put on a lot more carbon than young forests. So preserving old growth is a strategy for sequestering carbon, in addition to all the other amazing values that old growth forests have ecologically and culturally. The United Nations, with their REDD framework, reducing deforestation and degradation, has talked a lot about carbon banking, right? So paying forest owners to keep their trees so that they absorb carbon, and then accounting for that carbon over many years. Though it's very tricky to keep, to fully know if the forest is going to be safe from fire or safe from insect infestations. So there's lots of leaks in the accounting when it comes to carbon sequestration in forests. But there's a lot of social enterprises devoted to this area of forest carbon. In BC, in British Columbia especially, the forest products industry is pushing trees as part of their, they're trying to get developers to integrate more wood products into buildings, because once you pull that wood out of the forest, it's got that carbon for a very long time. So it's a kind of a way of sequestering carbon. And this building that you see on the slide is at the University of British Columbia. It's actually the tallest wood-framed building in the world, and they just completed construction last year. It's a dorm building for students, undergraduates, and it's very beautiful. But so a lot of industry in BC is pushing this notion that cutting more trees is sequestering more carbon in the forest products, and then planting the trees is sequestering that carbon, even more carbon. So a lot of conversation to be had about the economics of trees and forests, but that's really not the purpose of our conversation. All right, so to summarize and conclude, and then I'll talk about the assignment for next week, and then we can have a conversation. Trees and forests are primordial earth beings, right? That's the sort of the language that I want to use here. They evolved long before human beings, and they have been around doing their thing for a long time, and they are beings that share this planet with us. Human beings evolved in their presence, in the shade of trees, and through their products, right? We are who we are through trees in a lot of ways, right? So there's an inseparable relationship there between human evolution, human culture, trees and forests. So there's an entanglement, I want to say, between trees and forests. Though there's a lot of threats to the global forest: deforestation, land conversion, degradation, fragmentation, we've made a lot of gains. Increased protected areas, reduce the rate of deforestation, a big shift in consciousness towards protecting trees and forests, towards being in in better relationship with trees and forests. And moving forward, as we talk about mitigating and adapting to climate change, trees and forests are an essential tool for that. And I guess one thing I would add to that is that in addition to being spaces for our mental health during COVID, um, uh, viruses that can transmit themselves from animals to humans often happen on the edges of forests, trees and forests, right? So protecting forests is also a kind of biosecurity conversation, right? Making sure that trying to keep from having these close contact with wild animals, and of course some global regulation on bushmeat and wild animals, I think would be another important factor. All right, but we can talk about that in a minute. But your assignment for next week that we'll talk about next week, going from 0 to 1, is I want you to start with your home, your room, wherever you live or work, and just sort of take in the biodiversity, the tree biodiversity of your own space, right? What kinds of things are made of wood? Is your house wood framed? Is your furniture wood framed? And how close can you get to guessing how old or what species they are? Then I want you to head outside into your neighborhood. If you have a yard front and back, do a bit of an inventory of the trees in your spaces. Spend some time with them, see how they're doing, and then move out into either the street trees or a nearby park or your neighborhood and see what varieties and species of trees are there. And just take some time to reflect and to be present to those trees. All right, so that's your assignment there. I'm gonna stop sharing and you can come back on board and we can have a conversation, or you can ask questions or have comments. Any thoughts, questions?
There was near where I live, they cleared a whole bunch of trees over there on Finlay to build some houses. They had beautiful trees. And
Yeah.
I felt sad. I felt like really, really sad for about, I don't know, a couple of weeks. And even still, it makes me feel sad. Like I feel a great sense of powerlessness in doing anything about it. And I felt, I don't know, just in my heart, I felt really sad.
Did you have a close relationship to those trees before they cut them down?
Well, just looking at them, really.
Yeah.
Not that I ever went close to them. I think they were on people's properties, like there were 4 or 5, 6 houses there. And so they were around people's houses, but I used to walk on that street and really enjoy the look of them. I could see them from my window. Now I just see concrete.
Yeah.
So I put down some trees around the garden that I have. I've only a small garden, but I put down some trees to compensate for it. And I feel happier that I've done that. But still, I mean, it's amazing how they affect your well-being actually when that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. They can really improve your mood a lot. We're going to talk about that in week 4, I think. Just all of the physiological benefits to going on forest walks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jason. That was really thorough. Like, I really appreciate sort of the depth of this. I've been focusing, and with my partner doing a PhD on trees, we've been sort of going everywhere. And I actually followed her in January. We went and visited Sheffield with her research, which was centered around a lot of the activists there who were preserving the street trees. And it's been, I can relate to Sandra. You're sort of talking about the trees because on our street in the last 5 years, we've lost about 50 trees. And it's just sort of like gutted. And every time I go on my walk, it's sort of like the absence of the trees is this pain that's really present. And sort of seeing that concrete and seeing the what would be a really sort of rich biodiversity of just sort of weeds that protected the little drainage is now just lawn fertilizer going down into a ditch. And it's kind of demoralizing.
Was it like a liability thing, or were they diseased, or what was did you find out why?
It's, I couldn't relate, and I think it's sort of why I'm wanting to take this course, is sort of this connection of what drives people to make those decisions.
Yeah.
I think it's the trees. I could go into depth about it. Like, they were all silver maples, which can be a pretty, like, they have a lifespan. They don't live a long time, and they sort of lose branches. But it's, I would say, just general neglect. No one's up for maintaining them, and then they haven't replaced them. And so it's, it seems easier to remove a whole tree than prune it. And then the real sad part is the good trees, that the homes that people sort of had. We saw a lot of white pines that came down, and oaks, because there was one of the silver maples did hit a tree, and then we noticed like everyone else took out all their trees. They became like a liability.
Oh wow. Yeah, because some, like, arborists often are trained to think in terms of, liability, right? They might think a tree is beautiful personally, but their jobs are to figure out if this is a potential threat to a property owner or to the city or whatever, right? And they can be very risk averse, and like err on the side of caution, and then all of a sudden the tree is completely gone. That happened to me. Your story reminded me of when I was living in Bellingham for a few months during my PhD, and we had this enormous arbutus tree that was coming up through the backyard in between these two houses. And I guess maybe it was getting under the foundation, but the landlord didn't notify us at all. But I just came home one day and it was just gone, just completely gone. And it was a visceral kind of like loss, because I would go out and sit under this tree a lot, and it was just, wow. So the difference in a landscape can be so stark in a tree's absence like that. So is your partner doing the PhD in trees, or are you doing the PhD in trees? Are you both?
Megan is. So
Okay.
So I'm probably going to tell her to come join us for this class and send you some more money. It's sort of, it's nice to be in a group to talk trees.
Yeah. You're doing, are you teaching, or are you doing graphic design?
I'm teaching right now.
Okay.
And thinking of switching gears and becoming an arborist.
Oh, cool. Okay. We lost Rhea. I don't know what happened to Rhea, but anyway, any thoughts, Jay Brown or Holly Brown?
Yeah, I got a question for you, Jason. This was sort of a philosophical shift for me. Let's, how are we going to balance, okay, the need from emerging economies for their need for space and resources with the ecological importance of trees? I mean, you look at Brazil and India and Southeast Asia, those economies are pushing, and trying to find space and trying to find resources. At what level can there be interventions to at least maintain nice forests and still give these economies an opportunity to grow?
Yeah. Well, that's a $1 million question, right? How do we balance ecological integrity and economic growth? And there's a bunch of different answers depending on who you talk to. From my perspective, governments that are not corrupt, that are not in the pockets of the industries that are pushing these things, have the power to balance public and private interests, and they usually do a pretty good job of designating biodiversity hotspots in protected areas, and then directing economic growth into areas that have already been modified or cultivated. Brazil has made tons of progress. They have 30% of the Amazon in protected areas. So a lot of the fire and deforestation coming out of Brazil is mostly on private land, being pushed up against indigenous reserves or ranch lands. But that's always going back and forth. China is a net forest producer. They're planting millions of trees to keep the desert at bay in the north. Whether or not those trees qualify as ecological forests is another question, because they're basically monocultural plantations, so it's a tricky question. But some have said that there's actually more trees globally today than there was 2 decades ago, because of the massive afforestation efforts in Africa and China. So that's a big question. But I guess conservationists are trying to get people to shift towards certification. So there's the Forest Stewardship Council certifies forestry operations so that you can both generate revenue and do it sustainably. The big question, I think, that I don't have an answer to is palm oil. Palm oil is in everything we eat, and it's very efficient. It's the most efficient palm for producing oil. So it really is the the best commodity crop, but it's really pushing up against these rainforest areas in Southeast Asia, right? And you can't really plant palm oil in shade. You kind of have to clear an area. So people are wrestling with how to balance the economic incentive to produce palm oil with the habitat for orangutans, right? Like, people don't want orangutans to go extinct. So yeah, it's an ongoing question. But
Yeah,
it's a good question.
sure. And I think in a lot of cases too, they would, economies would be better served to stop worrying about how to convert fossil fuels and vehicles that run them, and spend more time developing what's happening with electric cars. I mean, it's just incredible what's happened. And technology seems to be moving ahead to the point where maybe that conversation or that conflict is going to go away. So we can still have the trees and we can still have our vehicles,
Yeah, exactly. All right. Any other thoughts?
Jace, I'm going to have to jump off here. Thank you. That was wonderful. And I'll be diligent in looking around the house and going outside in our yard in the neighborhood. And what your mom and I are thinking about doing is we've got an opportunity every time we go on a horseback ride to be out in the middle of some beautiful desert. And although where we are right here, there are not too many trees. There's a lot of cactus and a lot of scrub and things like that. There are opportunities just a little bit further north from here, up in Sholo and Pine Top, where there'll be a lot of trees and an opportunity to get a little bit more acquainted with the species here in Arizona.
Cool. Yeah, I look forward to reading those reflections or hearing your report back.
That'd be good. All right, son. Love you. Talk to you soon.
All right, love you. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
All right.
So,
any thoughts there?
So I'm reading the Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, which sort of had the evolution of roots and how that sort of came about with the connection between the wood wide web, I guess, sort of expanding. And I noticed that was sort of left out of your talk. I think maybe you're going to bring it up later on.
Oh yeah, for sure. When we talk about paradigm shifts, I'm going to talk about going from the sort of commodity-based view of trees and forests to the organismic, and we'll talk about mycelium and all of that. Yeah.
I started making some ink for my journal
Cool.
last night
Awesome.
from some ink caps in the yard.
So cool. That's awesome. Yeah, so cool. Yeah, so any other questions you had, or anything that wasn't clear in on the slides?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sandra.
The difference between, like you gave the definition of the trees as a forest. I know this maybe sound simple, but is there a difference between a forest and a wood? You know, like you go into the woods. There's some woods up there I go a lot up to Fort Langley. There's Heritage Trail up there. Now that's a wood, or is it a forest? Like, what's the difference between a wood and a forest? Or is there a difference, or what goes on there?
Yeah, so typically, I think it's English terminology to refer to forests as woodlands, the woods. So I don't think there's a big difference between a forest and a woodland. But we do get into a kind of a difference between a forest and a savanna, where there's not enough water to sustain close, clusters of trees, but these sort of spaced out trees, and that's more of a savanna ecosystem. And then those were created by indigenous peoples using fire. So acorns and oak savannas were created using fire. Not necessarily artificially, but sort of symbiotically between humans and fire. Because if you exclude fire, then other species tend to grow up into those areas, or the oaks just become very dense, right? So that's a good question.
So a wood and a forest are the same thing then?
Yeah, I would say they're synonyms.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I've got another deep time question. So one of the trees that I'm going to sort of hunt out is the Osage orange. And that got me sort of looking at other ones. I think the honey locust also developed these large spikes or large thorns. And were they connected to sort of like the megafauna? And how did that, I guess, the large megafauna of North America affect North American forests, if at all?
That seems like that's out of my expertise. Maybe Megan knows.
I gotta track someone down.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if it's, but I'm curious because
that's such
I've
a
yet
good
to see
question.
one.
Maybe you can bring the answer to that next week.
Be my journal.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. So let me show you a couple of my resources. In terms of, I talked about, having a guide. Like, this is kind of what I use for just the basics, plants of Pacific Northwest coast, right? That's my basic kind of guide. But I've actually been spending some time with this, which is basically they're oracle cards. So it's, some people not into it, but I kind of like it. It's basically these daily cards that you draw, different cards, and there's 50 different trees. And, some people use them as a kind of like tarot, right? Like they do divination. But for me, it's just more of a meditation, right? It's sort of, that's the sort of tree that marks the day for me. I don't ascribe any more significance to it than that. And so each species has a kind of description, right? And they kind of go through and talk about each one. And so that's, if you're not as interested in the analytical side of things, then that to me is a kind of a fun way to do a daily meditation with trees. And then the other one is a little more user-friendly or visually friendly, is Sibley's Guide to Trees. That's a great one for North America. So those two. But this one has a lot of really cool indigenous perception and use of trees. So if you're in the region. Obviously, Jason, it doesn't work for your region, but there might be an equivalent.
I got the Peterson.
Oh, nice.
He's a local guy.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. Great. Yeah.
You said you wanted us to do, what do you mean by flashcards? You said create flashcards. What are they?
Yeah, so a flashcard is just a little card that you use to memorize something, right? You write down the name of a tree and then the Latin on the back, or the name of a tree and then like the information about it on the back. But, you know, if you don't want to create flashcards, you could just, you know, spend time with one, you know, like, okay, this morning I'm just going to spend some time with Douglas fir and just sort of take in the information about Douglas fir, right? So it's really pretty flexible. Just the idea is to pick 15 to 20 trees that you're going to get to know better over the course of the 5 weeks.
Do you put a picture on the flashcard?
You can if you want. Yeah. If you wanna be better at identifying it when you come across it.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts? If not, we can wrap things up, and I will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah, you're welcome. I'll see you same time next week.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.